Before you hear this story, I want you to understand something. Every disturbing moment you're about to witness, every fear, every humiliation, every trembling breath was not created by the man at the center of this tale. It was reflected, borrowed, returned with the exact weight it once carried. Because this is not a legend. This is not a ghost tale whispered in the dark. This is the true account of a man named Moses Jackson. A man born into chains, who learned to turn those chains into a mirror so sharp, so unforgiving, that 9 powerful slave masters were finally forced to look at themselves. And what they saw terrified them. Imagine the deepest cruelty of the American South, not the whips, not the chains, not the fields, but the system behind it. The breeding system. A machine designed to treat human beings like livestock, pairing them like cattle, forcing conception like clockwork, and measuring children not by their names but by their dollar value. This system was cold, calculated, clinical, and Moses Jackson grew up inside it. He watched it, learned it, memorized every cog and wheel, until the day he realized he could make that same machine turn backward. Not with violence, not with rebellion, but with the one thing slave owners never imagined could destroy them: their own paperwork, because Moses understood something they didn't. Men who build cruelty into a system believe they can control it forever. They believe their power is mechanical, guaranteed, self-sustaining. They never imagine the day that machine might be turned around slowly, quietly, until its gears begin grinding against them instead. And by the time they hear the noise, it's already too late. What Moses did was not loud. It was not chaotic. It was patient, deliberate moral horror, a kind of justice carved from inside their own walls, using their own rules. And for the first time, these 9 men who forced others to breed on command were placed on rotations, schedules, examinations, and humiliations they once imposed, not by a mob, not by an uprising, but by a single man who knew the system better than they did. A man they thought was invisible. But before we go deeper into this story, I want to ask you something. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Tell me in the comments. And if you appreciate how much time, research, and heart goes into creating stories like this for you, please make sure you're subscribed to the channel. It helps me bring you more truths the world tried to bury. ***, the world Moses Jackson was born into was not just a plantation, it was a factory. A place where human life was calculated, measured, and scheduled with the cold precision of a livestock operation. The fields were only one part of the machine. The real engine, the real profit center, was the breeding system. Slave owners didn't hide it. They bragged about it. Some plantations in the South became known as stud farms, where the value of a person was determined not by their strength or skill, but by their ability to reproduce on command. Men were forced to father children with women they did not choose. Women were pushed into pregnancies like it was their duty to the soil. It was a clock that never stopped ticking, a cycle of conception, birth, and sale. Babies became ledger entries, mothers became numbers, and love was a luxury no one dared to imagine. Moses' mother, Esther, lived her entire life inside this system. She was quiet, observant, and carried an exhaustion that settled into her bones. But she was also clever, a woman who saw everything and spoke only when it mattered. Esther had been paired, traded, and reassigned more times than she could count. The overseers talked about her like she was a tool that wore out too quickly. Yet, in the moment she held her son, she held him like he was the world's last piece of innocence. Moses was her first child that survived. Others had been sold before they were old enough to walk. She never saw them again. She held that grief behind her eyes, but she never let it fall onto Moses. Instead, she poured silence, patience, and observation into him. She knew that survival required a different kind of intelligence. Moses grew up watching the breeding routines long before he understood their meaning. He saw men pulled from cabins in the middle of the night, led like bulls by overseers with lanterns. He saw women forced into sheds with straw on the floor and no privacy, their eyes empty, their hands trembling as they waited for the door to open. He heard whispers of good stock, strong hips, fast breeders. He learned early that the language of the plantation was not English. It was numbers, ratios, ages, values, every life reduced to a future price. And for reasons no one could explain, The overseers never paid much attention to Moses. He was small, sickly at times, and soft-spoken. They assumed he wouldn't grow into much. But Esther saw something they didn't. She saw the way his eyes followed the plantation records when the overseer left them on the table. She noticed how he stared at the markings and symbols as if they were telling him secrets. So one evening, when Moses was no more than 7, Esther did something dangerous, something that could have cost her life. She showed him how to read. It was nothing more than a page torn from a discarded Bible. She traced the letters with her finger while Moses watched. "These shapes," she whispered, "they have power. More power than any whip." He listened. He memorized. And soon, the letters no longer looked like symbols. They looked like keys. That small act opened the door to everything Moses would become. By the time he reached 10, he wasn't just reading. He was studying, observing, watching the way overseers flipped through the breeding ledgers with their fat fingers, checking boxes, noting pregnancies, marking transfers. Every page was a map of control, of who belonged to whom, who was worth more after childbirth, who was next in line to be paired. Moses became obsessed not with the cruelty itself, but with the way the cruelty was organized, documented, justified. The ledger was the plantation's heartbeat, and Moses, quietly, secretly, patiently, began to learn its rhythm. Moses Jackson learned early that the safest place to survive was in plain sight but unseen. He moved through the plantations like a shadow, present but ignored, invisible to those who had no reason to notice him. The overseers walked past him without a second glance, their minds occupied with schedules, quotas, and reports. The owners, for all their wealth and education, rarely bothered to look past the surface. They measured obedience, production, and profit, not the humanity of those who carried it out. And in this blind spot, Moses thrived. By observing quietly, Moses began to map the world around him. He memorized the routes the handlers used to move between cabins and fields. He noted which overseers drank heavily after lunch, which ones gambled in the evenings, and which ones were easily bribed for small favors. He watched when and how servants were moved between houses, who could be trusted with messages, who whispered too much, and who stayed silent when it mattered. Every pattern, every routine, every predictable behavior was a piece of information that only someone who saw everything could collect. And Moses did. But the most important lesson he absorbed wasn't about routes or routines. It was about priorities. The owners cared more about the numbers than the people. Birth rates, pairings, productivity. The ledgers didn't lie. They captured every pregnancy, every miscarriage, every sale, and every child assigned to another estate. People were not people, they were entries. Columns of data, each meticulously recorded, each carefully evaluated. And in that realization, Moses planted a seed. If the system valued numbers above humanity, then it could be manipulated. If it relied on documentation and routine, it could be turned back on itself. The idea didn't yet have a shape, but it was growing, quiet, persistent, like a shadow in his mind. By the time he was 16, that seed began to take root in a very practical way. His intelligence, sharpened by years of careful observation, could no longer remain hidden. Silas Ruddled, ever eager for efficiency, noticed it. Instead of punishing Moses for being smarter than his station, Ruddled saw an opportunity. He assigned Moses to clerical duties, a position of rare trust for someone born enslaved. Moses now worked in the record-keeping office, a small building adjacent to the main house where ledgers tracked every detail of the plantations. Operations, names, ages, physical traits, assigned pairings, transfers, everything was recorded there. Everything he now had access to. At first, Moses was careful. He copied entries into fresh ledgers, keeping his handwriting neat, his posture deferential, his demeanor exactly what Ruddled expected: obedient, efficient, invisible. But behind his calm exterior, Moses felt a thrill of knowledge he had never known before. Every record he touched revealed a layer of power. Births, deaths, family separations, all meticulously logged. The planning, the scheduling, the cold logic of it all, it was horrifying, but it was also a key, a blueprint. The other owners had assumed that no enslaved person could possibly understand the significance of their ledgers. Moses had proven them wrong. Literate, patient, meticulous, and silent, he was now entrusted with the very machinery that sustained their cruelty. It was like being given the keys to a fortress by the people who built it, unaware that one of the walls would eventually crumble from the inside. As he copied each line, studied each page, and memorized each schedule, Moses was learning something even more crucial than the logistics of forced breeding. He was learning the psychology behind it, the owner's obsession with control, the meticulous documentation, the unshakable confidence in their own system. They thought it was absolute. They assumed it could never be turned against them. But Moses saw that blind spot. He saw the fragility behind the full weight of power, and in that quiet understanding, the first outlines of a plan began to form. The ledger was no longer just a tool of oppression, it would become the instrument of reckoning. The 9 men who controlled the plantations of the Yazu Delta were more than wealthy landowners. They were architects of a system so cold and precise that even their peers sometimes recoiled at its efficiency. Silas Ruddled, the central figure in the consortium, was a man whose charm and intelligence masked a ruthless pragmatism. To outsiders, he was civic-minded, attending church and sitting on boards. But behind the polished manners lay a man who could discuss the conception schedules of human beings as casually as the price of cotton. His sin was not ignorance or cruelty in isolation, it was the normalization of dehumanization, the ability to reduce entire lives to data points without a flicker of conscience. Ruddled believed the structure he had built was untouchable, a fortress of logic that would withstand any challenge. Bartholomew Crenshaw was less calculating than Ruddled, but no less dangerous. Where Ruddled saw data, Crenshaw relied on routine and ritual, imposing schedules on his enslaved people with an almost obsessive adherence to order. He took pride in the smooth running of his estate and the predictability of human behavior under his control. Yet beneath his arrogance was a man who believed in the morality of his own decisions, which made him all the more terrifying. In his mind, the breeding program wasn't cruelty, it was stewardship, a way to cultivate human stock for the greater good of the plantation's profitability. Josiah Pryor was the scholar among them, a man who could quote scripture and economic theory with equal fluency. He approached slavery as a discipline project, meticulously noting the strengths and weaknesses of those he considered property. To him, each person was a study, each pregnancy a case. Pryor's intelligence gave him confidence that nothing could outmaneuver him, yet it blinded him to the possibility that someone might use his own methods against him. Nathaniel Pendergast, tall and imposing, carried the air of someone accustomed to unquestioned obedience. His estate was run with military precision, overseers reporting daily progress and failures. Yet his cruelty was subtle, embedded in the expectation that human beings were instruments to be sharpened for maximum output. He did not strike in anger, he struck in method. Cyrus Whitfield had a reputation for generosity in public, offering alms to the town's poor and attending every church social. But generosity, he believed, did not extend to those he considered property. His arrogance lay in the assumption that he could compartmentalize morality, treating people as numbers without moral consequence. Augustus Fairchild, younger than most, had inherited wealth and ambition in equal measure. He admired Ruddled's system and sought to emulate it with a devotion that bordered on fanaticism. The breeding program to him was not just business, it was the measure of civilization itself. His hubris lay in the belief that the careful orchestration of human lives was his right, his inheritance, and no one could challenge it. Cornelius Vance was a man of practicality, pragmatic and unemotional. He preferred numbers to words and schedules to spontaneity. He participated in the consortium not out of malice, but because it was profitable, and the system had convinced him that profit required control at any cost. His arrogance was the quiet kind, the sort that lulls you into underestimating its consequences. Thaddeus Beaumont was energetic and mercurial, quick to anger but equally quick to forgive himself for any misstep. He enjoyed the power the system gave him and, unlike the others, sometimes revealed a predatory glee in its operation. Yet his humanity remained intact, which only made his capacity for cruelty more chilling. He understood the suffering he caused, and proceeded anyway, believing he could contain it. Finally, Edmund Hulsey, perhaps the least outwardly ambitious, relied on the collective authority of the consortium. His cruelty was indirect, a willingness to participate rather than question, to follow procedures that would break bodies and spirits alike. His arrogance lay in conformity. By aligning himself with the others, he insulated himself from moral scrutiny, believing he was safe because no one noticed his complicity. Moses Jackson studied them all with a patience born of necessity. Over years of observation, he noted not just their movements, but their patterns of thought. He saw how Ruttle's overconfidence created blind spots, how Crenshaw's reliance on ritual made him predictable, how Pryor's intelligence could be exploited because it was rigid. Each man had a weakness, each a vulnerability that the system itself amplified. And while they saw themselves as masters of the plantations, they were, in Moses's eyes, predictable machines. Every ledger entry, every decision, every interaction left traces like footprints in sand. And Moses memorized them all. He learned when each man would retire to his study, when he would take his evening brandy, which overseers he trusted and which ones he feared. In their belief of invincibility, they had created the map that would one day become their undoing. The 9 masters were human, deeply human, and it was precisely that humanity, twisted and unchecked by conscience, that Moses Jackson would exploit with cold precision. It began with a subtle change, almost imperceptible, yet it rippled through the consortium like a stone dropped into still water. The plantations hummed with the usual rhythm of labor, the overseers issuing orders, the enslaved people moving between fields and cabins, the dogs barking along the fences, the occasional clatter of wagons carrying cotton bales to the river docks. Everything appeared normal, a perfect imitation of the predictable order the 9 masters relied on. No one noticed the shift. At first, Moses Jackson, seated in the small, sunlit record-keeping office at Willow Creek, opened the ledger as he had done countless times before. His quill hovered over a page listing one of the consortium's key personnel assignments. Among the columns of names, dates, and duties, he paused at a single entry, a routine transfer of a young man. From Bartholomew Crenshaw's plantation to Edmund Hulsey's, nothing unusual about it on the surface. Just another bureaucratic note in a meticulously maintained system. But Moses's hand moved with deliberate care, and with a slight adjustment in the wording. The young man's status changed. On paper, he had been transferred. In reality, he had disappeared, hidden in a location known only to Moses and a small network he had been cultivating in secret for years. The afternoon passed in its customary lethargy. The overseers made their rounds, the enslaved people completed their tasks, and the masters conducted their business with the same self-assured composure they had always displayed. But when Crenshaw summoned his driver that evening, expecting him to report for routine duties, he found the man gone. Confusion rippled. First questions shouted across the yard, a cursory search of the fields, a glance at the slave cabins, but the missing man remained absent. Crenshaw's confidence faltered, replaced by irritation. Perhaps the young man had wandered off, perhaps some minor error in the accounting. The rationalizations kept the first threads of fear at bay, yet the feeling settled in Crenshaw's chest like cold lead. Meanwhile, Moses went about his tasks with a calmness that betrayed nothing. He updated other ledgers, copied letters between plantation owners, and carried correspondence as if nothing had shifted in the world around him. His face, placid and unreadable, gave no hint of the quiet upheaval he had orchestrated. The tension, however, thickened around him. The air in the manor house seemed to carry a subtle charge, a dissonance that the masters could not name. Each step they took in their evening routines was accompanied by an unshakable sense that something was slightly off, that the world they had meticulously built had developed an imperceptible tremor beneath their feet. By nightfall, the situation became undeniable. Crenshaw, pacing his study and sipping on evening brandy, realized the young man had vanished without a trace. He ordered guards, sent messengers to neighboring estates, questioned every enslaved person. But the result was the same: no answers, only silence. The fear that had begun as an uncomfortable whisper now grew into a gnawing dread. The carefully constructed illusion of control, the very foundation of the consortium, was cracking. Yet through it all, Moses remained invisible in plain sight. His calm detachment, the serene precision with which he carried out his clerical duties, only heightened the sense of unease. The masters could not fathom how someone they had considered property could wield such subtle power, nor did they yet understand that this was only the beginning. One altered entry in a ledger, one small act of misdirection, had set a chain reaction in motion that the 9 masters were entirely unprepared for. And as the sun set over the cotton fields, casting long shadows across the Yazu Delta, an invisible hand had begun to redraw the boundaries of power quietly, methodically, irreversibly. Asterisk, the unraveling began subtly, like the first cracks in a mirror that had long reflected only confidence and control. Each of the 9 masters had built lives rooted in meticulous order, and yet, that very obsession with schedules and precision became the instrument of their undoing. It was never sudden. It was methodical, almost surgical, the way a careful surgeon might dismantle a structure from the inside, leaving outward appearances intact until the foundation quietly gives way. Bartholomew Crenshaw was the first to show visible signs of decline. Once the proud steward of over 70 enslaved people, he became haunted by the invisible weight of his own creation. Each morning he woke with a gnawing sense that something was watching him, monitoring his every movement. Tasks that had once seemed trivial, checking crop yields, inspecting fences, reviewing labor assignments, now filled him with dread. Even the simplest of reports felt suspect, as if numbers on the page were mocking him. His sleep became restless, haunted by recurring nightmares of schedules and rotations. The very language he had once used to reduce human beings to data points, now a tool of psychological torment. Josiah Pryor, equally methodical in his management, began noticing subtle, inexplicable changes on his plantation. Breeding charts disappeared overnight. Assignments of women and men he had carefully scheduled seemed altered, rewritten with a precision that no random mischief could achieve. At first, he blamed overseers, perhaps an ambitious field hand attempting minor sabotage. But the changes were too deliberate, too perfectly aligned with his own meticulous system. Panic began to seed itself. Each day, the consistency of the consortium's operations, the lifeblood of his perceived security, eroded. Nathaniel Pendergast, whose arrogance had always been tempered by a firm reliance on order, discovered his personal rituals and marriage were being violated in ways too intimate to ignore. One morning he woke to find notes laid out on his desk, an annotated roster with his own name inserted among the patterns he had used to dictate the reproductive lives of others. The implication was horrifying. The system he had weaponized against the enslaved now turned on him. Fear gnawed at his pride, a sense of helplessness that he could not rationalize. Marital trust dissolved as subtle evidence suggested secret manipulations, whispered hints that he could not ignore. His wife, terrified by odd, seemingly innocuous visits from house servants who arrived on exact schedules he could not track, began withdrawing into herself, leaving Pendergast alone to face the growing pressure of his unraveling world. Cyrus Whitfield's estate suffered a different assault, one that preyed upon his obsession with control. Entire sections of his breeding ledgers vanished overnight, erased as cleanly as though they had never existed. The records he relied upon to plan months, even years, in advance were gone, leaving him with only uncertainty, a concept he had never tolerated. The loss of information bred paranoia, and soon Whitfield began to suspect his peers, believing they had acted out of jealousy or spite. Trust, once a cornerstone of the consortium's cohesion, dissolved. Even casual conversations among the owners became riddled with accusations and half-formed suspicions. Augustus Fairchild, a man who had once relished the clinical efficiency of managing human lives, became subject to the same daily evaluation he had imposed on countless women. Chained and seated, presented with a ledger detailing his own reproductive history, his intelligence, and his physical attributes, Fairchild felt a terror that no whip or threat could ever evoke. The quiet meticulousness of the ordeal, the clinical, unemotional presentation of his own productive schedule, stripped him of pride, dignity, and the illusion of superiority. His mind, so long trained to reduce others to function and outcome, now struggled to resist the very calculus he had perfected. Thaddeus Beaumont and Cornelius Vance experienced a creeping isolation, amplified by whispers and the subtle gaze of neighbors who noticed odd behaviors. The once confident masters began mistrusting each other, reading gestures and remarks for hidden meaning. Meetings that had been forms of business negotiation now became arenas of suspicion. Each man, certain that the next abduction or ledger anomaly was the doing of a rival, began monitoring his peers with the same meticulous attention he had once reserved for enslaved people. Yet, no one considered Moses Jackson. Invisible in plain sight, he remained a shadow moving between plantations, his participation so seamlessly integrated into daily routines that suspicion never touched him. Edmund Halsey, whose arrogance had been rooted in assumed invulnerability, was the last to visibly crack under the strain. His obsession with the physical condition of his human property translated into a frantic care for his own health. He scrutinized every meal, measured every pulse, monitored every servant with hypervigilance, fearing unseen contamination, poisoning, or sabotage. The psychological pressure compounded as he noted patterns too precise to be coincidence. Missing documents, altered schedules, subtle gestures from the enslaved that mirrored behaviors he had once encouraged in breeding rotations. By the end of the 18 months, the 9 masters were unrecognizable. Their confidence had eroded, replaced by paranoia and fear. Families were strained, estates mismanaged, and social standing weakened. They no longer laughed at the cruelty they had orchestrated. They flinched at the thought of it. One by one, they admitted to each other in hushed, almost embarrassed tones that something had been applied to them, something precise, deliberate, personal. The whispers of neighbors, once insignificant, became a chorus of dread, reinforcing the notion that their control had been usurped. Through it all, Moses Jackson remained methodical and unseen. He had turned a system designed to dehumanize into a tool for justice, or at least the closest approximation of it that one enslaved man could wield. In the antebellum South, by exploiting the arrogance, routines, and assumptions of the 9 masters, he orchestrated their psychological collapse with an invisible hand, allowing them to experience a fraction of the suffering they had inflicted on hundreds of others. The plantations still stood, the fields still bore cotton, and the ledgers remained neatly organized. But the people who had once wielded power without consequence were forever changed. Each man carried a secret terror, a lived understanding of what it meant to be reduced to function and numbers, subjected to a system that did not see the person, only the output. And all the while, Moses Jackson, with quiet patience and an intelligence honed by decades of observation, had rewritten the rules, demonstrating that the greatest power in the Yazu Delta was not wealth, nor guns, nor ownership, but the ability to see the system clearly and operate it invisibly from within. The culmination of Moses Jackson's patient orchestration came with a move so audacious, it would have seemed impossible if anyone had suggested it aloud. By 1844, the 9 masters had already experienced disorientation, fear, and a creeping loss of control. But Moses knew that for the lesson to be fully understood, they needed to feel the system from the inside, not merely fear it from the outside. He began by exploiting their trust in authority and procedure, the very elements they had relied upon to control others for decades. Through subtle manipulations of documents and correspondence, Moses engineered what appeared to be an official medical mandate and order that carried the veneer of legitimacy. The masters, conditioned to obey schedules and written commands, accepted it without hesitation. The mandate outlined assessments and observations with strict timetables, assigned times, and even rotations. It was designed not to harm them physically, but to strip away every assumption of autonomy. Each man, once the architect of oppression, was now reduced to following instructions, moving between locations on precise schedules, reporting to supervisors they could not question, answering to protocols that had no justification beyond the instructions themselves. The psychological weight of this reversal was crushing. The men were acutely aware of being watched, monitored at every step, not by some supernatural force, but by a network of people they had long considered invisible, those they had overlooked, dismissed, or controlled without a thought. Every step they took, every note they were forced to read, every schedule they were compelled to follow reminded them of the countless enslaved people who had endured similar routines. whose lives had been dictated by cold, clinical efficiency. The power dynamic, once absolute and unquestioned, had inverted completely. Humiliation became a silent, persistent companion. These men, accustomed to asserting authority over the bodies and time of others, now lived under constant observation, subject to routines that were both arbitrary and meticulous. Their personal pride, once rooted in wealth, status, and control, began to crumble. The smallest error or hesitation, moving a minute too late, pausing too long at a door, was noted, catalogued, and mentally imposed as a violation. The invisible ledger, a concept they had once wielded as a tool, now governed their existence in ways they could neither predict nor resist. And yet, there was no explicit cruelty in the sense they had inflicted upon the enslaved. Moses understood the potency of the psychological over the physical. He did not need to harm their bodies. The terror, the confusion, the quiet erosion of their assumed invulnerability was punishment enough. Each man felt the weight of having their humanity reduced to function and schedule, experiencing firsthand the emotional and mental disorientation they had imposed on others for years. Fear, anxiety, and the relentless awareness of being under constant scrutiny replaced the brash confidence and entitlement that had once defined them. This careful, systematic reversal forced the masters to confront not just the abstract concept of oppression, but its lived reality. They were no longer arbiters of life and death, producers and proprietors. They were the subject of a system designed for control, observation, and compliance. Every ledger, every rotation, every schedule had become a mirror reflecting their own methods, now applied to themselves. By the time the rotations and inspections concluded, the 9 men were irreversibly changed. They understood the machinery of power, its dehumanizing logic, and the subtle cruelty of absolute control. Moses had not needed to threaten violence or inflict explicit harm. The mere orchestration of their own system, applied meticulously and invisibly, had delivered the lesson. And in this, the masterstroke of Moses Jackson's plan was revealed. The greatest fear was never of the enslaved rising up, but of the system itself, turned inward, teaching the creators what it truly felt like to be property, reduced to nothing more than schedules, observations, and function. By the spring of 1844, the aftermath of Moses Jackson's carefully orchestrated reversal rippled through the Yazu Delta like a silent storm. The psychological toll on the 9 masters was far from uniform, but it was devastating. 3 of the men, once proud, methodical, and self-assured, succumbed entirely to madness. Their minds, fractured by the relentless inversion of control they had wielded for decades, could no longer distinguish routine from threat, ledger from life. Paranoia became their constant companion. Whispers of invisible observers haunted every step, every glance, every quiet room. 2 others, unable to endure the shame and fear, sold their estates, attempting to escape not just their past deeds, but the spectral weight of what they had experienced. Yet even the sale of land and property could not erase the memory of having been made subject to the same system they had imposed on others. The buyers inherited fertile soil, but not the invisible ledger of psychological torment that Moses had inscribed into the very air of the plantations. For more fled Mississippi entirely, seeking anonymity in distant states, convinced that distance might bring them safety. They carried little more than wealth and ego, unaware that Moses had ensured the estate ledgers, the instruments of their control, now turned into instruments of revelation, never left the region. Every carefully documented schedule, every breeding record, every annotated observation of human life remained behind, preserved in plain sight but inaccessible to them, a testament to their own hubris. The Yazu Delta, once a hub of methodical exploitation and cold calculation, found its breeding system collapsing in ways that no outsider could fully understand. Without the oversight of the consortium, the routine rotations, and the rigid schedules, the carefully constructed machinery of human commodification unraveled. Enslaved people, long treated as property and function, experienced disruption, uncertainty, and in some cases, small spaces for autonomy, subtle cracks in the structure of absolute control. And through it all, Moses moved like a ghost in plain sight. He remained near the plantations, tending to his daily tasks, carrying himself with the same quiet efficiency that had allowed him to be invisible for so long. No one suspected that the young man who had read, copied, and observed the system with meticulous attention had been the architect behind its undoing. The master's fear, their dispersal, their madness had all unfolded under his watchful eye. He left no trace, no announcement, no flourish, only the faint echo of justice, delivered not through violence or law, but through cunning, patience, and the perfect application of their own cruel logic turned inward. The region would never be the same, and neither would the 9 men who had built its system of control. Moses Jackson had disappeared into history almost as silently as he had orchestrated it, leaving behind a story too unsettling for many to transcribe fully, a story that would echo for generations in the hearts of those who dared to reckon with it. He left the Delta quietly, taking only what he could carry and the woman he loved by his side. There were no celebrations, no speeches, no triumphant announcements. Moses Jackson moved like any other traveler along the road north, blending into towns and villages, observing the world with the same patient attention he had once applied to the ledgers. Every step was measured, careful, deliberate, an embodiment of restraint after years of silent calculation. He did not seek recognition. He did not seek vengeance beyond what he had already delivered. Yet even as he lived quietly, a myth began to take shape. Whispers traveled ahead of him from town to town, stories of a man who had turned cruelty against those who wielded it, who had made the powerful feel the weight of the machinery they had built. Some said he could make men vanish without a trace. Others claimed he walked with the knowledge of every injustice committed in the Delta, carrying it silently in his mind. People spoke of him in hushed tones, a name that inspired both awe and fear. Though few had ever seen him, Moses Jackson became more than a man. He became an idea, a quiet reckoning moving through the world, unseen yet inescapable. The story of Moses Jackson is not one that glorifies cruelty, nor does it celebrate vengeance for its own sake. What it reveals is far more unsettling, a system of oppression so rigid, so totalizing, that it produced its own undoing. Moses did not create the machinery of suffering, he merely became its mirror. In studying it, understanding it, and exploiting its assumptions, he forced the architects of human misery to confront a truth they had never considered, that the monsters they had made of others could, in time, be reflected back at them. And when they finally saw themselves exposed, powerless, subject to the same dehumanizing logic they had imposed, they shattered. Their arrogance, their hubris, and their belief in invincibility dissolved under the weight of a system they had never imagined could be turned against them. Moses Jackson walked away, silent and uncelebrated, but leaving behind a truth that endures. When oppression is perfected, it inevitably creates its own reckoning.